in conjunction with the exhibition Picturing a Pandemic, a visual experience of COVID-19 in Singapore. And today we have with us Brian Teo, who was one of the photographers who worked on the exhibition, the youngest photographer, in fact, that we got. And we're very happy to have you here to share your experiences with us. So yeah, we'll be having a chat with Brian today. And later on, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A. So if you have any questions for Brian throughout the entirety of the talk, feel free to scan the QR code below or click on the link, and you'll be directed to a pigeonhole page where you can submit some questions for Brian later on. Yeah, so thanks, Brian, again for coming here today and being with us. Maybe you want to introduce yourself a little bit, how you've found your experiences so far in photography.
Okay, I'll perhaps begin with a short timeline of my experiences. My father first introduced photography to me in 2011, so while on a holiday. So it's been almost a decade since then. But yeah, photography has been something that I found it was a way for me to record my outings with family and friends. And I think from one of the images that I presented, so from there I was sort of inspired by photographs online, and that's where I decided to go more in depth into photography. So yeah, based on this image, it was my mom and Kailin from almost 7 years ago.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a way for me to record these things because these are precious memories of us. And from there, as I mentioned, it went into um, digging deeper, trying to improve my photographs. And I started off with street photography, and I decided to do photo walks over the weekends. And it was also during this period where I went into film photography because I felt that film kind of slowed down the process. Yeah. And subsequently, jumping into 2017, I participated in the Objectives Shooting Home Youth Awards program. It's kind of like a mentorship program where um, people, sort of participants, get to work with mentors, and they sort of come up with a body of work, and there's a exhibition at the end of it.
What was your exhibition about?
I actually did it on Kailin as well.
Ah.
So the story was on single parenthood
Mm-hmm.
and how Kailin sort of coped with it.
Mm. Yeah, so we will talk to about Kailin a bit later as well, because she was also the subject for one of your series in the exhibition. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you go about from a very general point of view, how do you go about choosing your subjects or your processes in terms of framing a shot, for example?
Um, I find it would depend on the nature of the shoot. For street photographs, I find you can't really plan what you would see that day. So normally, what I would do is to um, sort of take the public transportation and then alight wherever I found things to be interesting, and then from there I'll let my feet take me wherever, and let the things unfold for me. But in terms of photo stories, I think um, it's another matter. You probably need to do more research and doing more liaising to be able to get access to certain places, depending on the stories that you're doing. Yeah, so there's more prep for that.
Mm. Is there any station that you remember that you got off that was you found something interesting?
Mm, I think it was somewhere at I think at Bugis, if I remember correctly. yeah, I was taking the bus, and then I saw some performers by the roadside, and I thought this would be something interesting to photograph, and that's where I alighted.
Hmm. So it's very organic, kind of. Yeah, finding angles or interesting subjects.
Which is also why I like street photography, because it sort of helped with um, capturing moments, because things about street photography is that it's very spontaneous and you can't really plan before that. So
Mm.
it's more about um, letting things surprise you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the slides again,
Mm.
and yeah, where I was. Yeah, this is the Shooting Home Youth Awards program.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a mentorship program, and at the end of it, there'll be a body of work. Yeah, and yeah, in 2018, I won my first competition. So the Singapore Youth Photographers Award. Yeah, so I did a series on Techi Opera as part of the team on sustainable communities. So throughout the 10 years of experiences so far, there definitely has been some ups and downs. But I am fortunate enough to be able to have the support from the people around me and who guided me along the way. And I find that it's very important have to find the inspiration to continue to improve your craft or any craft in general besides photography, and having a positive attitude does help as well.
For sure. Yeah, and I think we can see also the development of your craft through the photo series that you did for the exhibition. So just to introduce a little bit about the exhibition as well, picturing the pandemic started off as a commission for five photographers to capture Singapore's COVID experience all the way from circuit breaker, way back in April 2020, all the way until now. And so what we were trying to do with the exhibition was try to understand the pandemic in different ways, mindful that we were living through a sort of international moment that has affected basically everyone around the world, and also understanding the increasing necessity of rapid response collection, wherein we're documenting things that are happening as they happen, so that we are also not losing out on things as they pass us by. So yeah, so you were one of the photographers who contributed to this exhibition, quite a few series. So I wanted to ask, how did you go about choosing the topics? Because I mean, the pandemic is such a big experience, right? So how did you go about sort of angling that experience and choosing different moments or different points of view to capture?
Um, I guess perhaps I'll give a little background as to how I chose my topics. So even prior to this documentation, I was actually already photographing um, sort of people wearing masks on the street, and even during circuit breaker, I was already starting to photograph Kailin as part of my own personal collection, my own personal series that I wanted to do. So for the choosing of topics for this documentation, s- I wanted it to be sort of a continuation of that, and that's why for most of my series that I did, um, it's sort of focusing on daily interactions, and I chose stories that were closer to home. Um, so I wanted to voice the my thoughts and my impressions of this pandemic, and through that, I hope that um, the people that saw these photographs sort of resonated with them, and that's why I chose Kailin's experiences, HBL experiences, as one of them, along with how students coped with the changes in school. And for masking up, I was actually inspired by how people wore masks even before um, it was made compulsory, because it's not something that's in our culture to do so, even during the hay season. So photographing people with masks gradually evolved into um, people masking up in different public spaces. Yeah. And for social distancing, um, I wanted to focus on the aspect of unsung heroes, and because for these social distancing ambassadors, they are part of how do I put it? They are always part of the people that you see on a daily basis, but you don't usually pay any notice to them, and that's why I wanted to focus on the complexities of their roles and being thrown into um, such work, even though it's such a drastic change from their previous duties, is something worth commending. And last but not least, the general elections. I think this was a rather last minute um, sort of body of work that I wanted to do because the announcement for the general elections was also rather abrupt as well. And being a first time voter, I wanted to see how the various parties sort of campaigned without having physical rallies and reaching out to people, finding creative ways to reach out to people.
Yeah, I think for sure, basically every aspect of our life has been affected by this pandemic, from big events like the general election to school and even like what happens at home. How do we order food, for example, or so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think documenting this is a very like meta kind of thing, right? Because you are also experiencing the pandemic even as you are recording it. So what was that like? I mean, this is like I mean, obviously, no one's gone through this before, but also as a young person, like experiencing all of this, what was that experience like for you?
Um, I think I was too young to understand or to comprehend SARS as the first major pandemic that Singapore experienced. So for me, COVID-19 was um, very new to me as compared to my parents. So as I photographed, I realized that I focused on a lot on use, and I it wasn't a conscious decision to do so at that point in time, but I felt it was rather poignant to photograph Kailin and my alma mater, Clementi Primary and Commonwealth Secondary. They brought back a lot of wonderful memories that I had in school, but it was also sad at the same time to see how their school experience and their childhood will be forever changed, will be forever changed by the pandemic because there's obviously less interaction involved. And circuit breaker, I'm sure it was a tough period for everyone. Um, I think in terms of both the disruption of plans and being cooped up at home. Um, I guess for me, even as I found mini projects to do at home, it was hard to sustain interest. And I guess this documentation and this project gave me something to look forward to at that point in time in terms of both the planning and the execution phase.
Okay, yeah. I think a lot of people also turn to like these home projects. Like a lot of bakers popped up during the pandemic, so it's definitely good that it was also something that you could focus on as well. So maybe we'll jump into the different series that you did, and then you can also share with us a little bit on like more on your thought process behind it, or what you had meant to capture behind it as well.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think the first one we have was a series with your god sister Kailin, who you also mentioned previously, and who we saw a 10-year-old picture of in the start. So you did a series of your god sister's experience and her coming to stay with you. I think it was a very personal series, not quite different to the other ones that we had in the exhibition as well. And it was an interesting take on COVID. I thought that was sort of, I mean, given that the pandemic has redefined our individual and social interactions, a very interesting topic to choose. So, what was that like trying to present her story and yeah, and what did she think of it even?
Um, I think for Kailin, as she moved with us for that 2 months of circuit breaker, it was the first time that we spent so much time with her on a daily basis. And as a god brother, I guess I tried to help her cope with these changes, especially since she couldn't meet her friends physically in school anymore, and a lot of the work had to be online through her school portal. So I guess setting up the her sort of study desk for her was part of the changes and the part of the things that I did in the initial phase. And I guess doing homework and like studying every day isn't going to really help her sort of find ways to cope. So I guess our family tried to give her space by allowing her to express her thoughts through handicraft, drawings, or making things, and to expose her to different experiences that she probably wouldn't have sort of hands-on in school, such as watching my lovebird pet. Yeah, so my lovebird pet sort of flew into my home. I think it was about 1.5 months, 2 months before circuit breaker. So I guess as a rather new member to the family, she and Kailin sort of kept each other company during this difficult period as well. So yeah, I guess for documenting Kailin wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, because the emotions and um, sort of quiet moments impact you more, especially for people who are closer to you. So there were certain moments that I felt that it wasn't the right time to photograph, and I didn't decide to capture it, or even if I did, I didn't choose it to be part of this documentation. And yeah, she's still pretty shy about her photographs being on exhibition. She hasn't told any of her friends or
Oh no.
teachers. Although I think one of her friends did mention to her that he saw her on YouTube.
Yeah, as part of the conversation series, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and Kailin's photo I think introduces like the exhibition as well. So it's a big stage for her to be on. Um, but yeah, I think definitely like the idea of growing up has been hugely affected by this pandemic. And it's also nice to see from your perspective, I guess, like how Kailin is going through this as well. The home-based learning that she has to do. Um, and so on. Yeah. But it's great that she's got stuff to do as well, keeping your lovebird company and doing handicrafts and all that. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, on the topic of home-based learning as well. So after circuit breaker, the schools went back to people went back to school. And so you also managed to get access to some of the schools, including your alma mater, to take photographs of what the experience was like. Which I thought was quite interesting in terms of like you're returning to school as they're returning to school. So how did you find that, and was it difficult capturing all these pictures, or like how were they reacting to the new measures, or like sort of readapting to life, both the students and the teachers?
Um, I think seeing the way the students interacted with one another and the teachers brought back memories that I had as a student, especially for my alma mater. And it initially felt weird being able to walk around during lessons, because I was in those seats not too long ago.
Mm.
And I find for the secondary school students, it wasn't too difficult for them to cope with these changes. But I think for the primary school, they required a little bit more time to get used to this new routine. And while the tension was high, the students did find creative ways to sort of amuse themselves and to find joy even during these changes. So I think for the primary school, they did things like bottle flips in during their recess, scissors, paper, stone, but all 1 meters apart. I remember there was one group of students that saw me as I photographed them, and then they reached out their arms to show that they were 1 meters apart before continue playing.
Right.
Yeah, and for this picture, catching, but it felt almost like hide and seek because the catcher could never catch any one of his friends due to the 1 meter social distancing. So it was quite sad to be him because he had to constantly run around.
Right. So how did they end up catching, like?
It didn't end.
So it was just.
Yeah, it was just
Oh
them
no.
running around.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think even before the game ended, they had to return back to class. So I believe it was just them running around the canteen.
Right.
For the secondary school, they were more reserved. Many were reading books and or looking at their handphones during their recess. And being older, I think they were more cautious of their actions and their behaviors. So it wasn't too drastic for them as well.
Hmm. Yeah. So this picture is they were studying at.
This was at Commonwealth Secondary, so I went back to my alma mater, and the unique thing about them is that they actually DIY their own barriers
Mm.
to ensure that the students are equally spaced out. So because they have a D&T lab in school, and the
Oh.
teachers spend time building this, yeah, in preparation for the school reopening. So this was a unique aspect of the school that I wanted to cover and I wanted to show as well.
Hmm. That's a good use of D&T. um. Right. So how about the teachers? I guess because the teachers are really also on the front lines, as it were, and I think it's been quite difficult for them to adapt to. I think both home-based learning and then having to teach with like face shields and masks and trying to navigate that as well. So what was their experience? Did you talk to them or follow their experiences as well?
I initially wanted to photograph them in uh, the staff room, as this is sort of the space that I find it would really show the kind of changes, because especially since it's their work desk and there are many interactions between teachers going on. But I think for the schools, it was still a rather private space for the teachers, so I could only observe their behaviors and how they reacted in classes or in the canteen. But I find because the changes were all rather new. There wasn't any fixed regulation at that point in time for teachers. So I think for them, they tried. Some tried wearing face shields only while teaching, but then they had to stand at the front of the class. For others, they continued wearing masks as they taught lessons. So I think for it was even harder for teachers that juggled between like having students physically in school and online as well, because at that point in time, I think there could only be 2 or 3 levels in school at any one time. So the other half of the cohort was on home-based learning. So teachers that had students in different levels had to cope with this change, and I find it's rather commendable that they are able to, and especially when they have additional safe distancing duties that they have to do during the recesses, because the the students sometimes get carried away and they have to enforce the safe distancing rules. So even though it's very tiring for the teachers, I think they handled it rather well, and it's good that they set a good role model for the students.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a very difficult job for them as well, I'm sure. In terms of juggling all of those things. Um, yeah, what fun about this picture?
This was at Maristella, so they actually set up stand-ups for the students to sort of remind them, and then apart from that, they have teachers. I wouldn't say patrolling, but um, they were ensuring that the students had their mask on after they finished eating, or ensured that there was safe distancing between the students.
Hmm. Did you see them like taking these photos and making these cardboard cutouts?
Uh, I think I was at Maristella for 3 or 4 days. It was one of the days that I saw them carrying these cutouts,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not sure how they got them because it wasn't it. The cutouts are like photos of primary school
Yeah.
students, but yeah, I'm not sure how they got hold of them, but they started laying them out
Mm.
around the canteen.
I think visually we've also had a lot of collaterals telling us like about safe distancing and things like that. So it's a whole different another visual culture that's being created, as it were, as we go in the pandemic. Yeah, it's very interesting development of this stuff. I think you were also talking about like like PE, um, which is a very physical lesson, right? So how did students go about doing like adapting to that? I think you had a picture during taken during a PE lesson as well.
For PE lessons, they had to be spaced out 1 meters apart, so it was quite unique. I think the students found it rather amusing as well because um, usually for PE there's always some form of interaction with one another, be it during trainings or games. But for this instance, they had to be spaced out 1 meters apart, and I think I really enjoyed the one session that they had in primary school. So they had every student had to stand within a hula hoop, and they had to um, sort of change as they bounced the ball. They had to change positions. So it was. I think the students still found it still found it rather fun, but uh, yeah, it was something really new to them, and the teacher also quite had kind of had a hard time trying to get them to keep within the hoops because the ball would roll out and then they would
Right.
have to
Yeah.
get it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, but I think the students did enjoy themselves, and seeing the way they behaved during such sessions, it didn't really feel like a pandemic was going on. Yeah. And for the secondary schools, they um, sort of did static exercises. So it was mainly push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks, or jogging on the spots. So it was things like that that could help ensure safe distancing while being able to do PE without mask on.
Mm.
Yeah.
But no like games or
No games, no
okay.
games, because I think the moment they had to, I mean, there couldn't be any form of
Yeah.
interaction, and I think a lot of games involved
Yeah,
interaction,
for
so
sure.
I
Y-
think they omitted that. So
Mm.
even for the basketball courts and the football fields, they were cordoned off.
Mm.
Yeah.
You could play a no contact rugby. But yeah, I think interesting all the different aspects of life that have been even a PE teachers like how do you plan a PE lesson without interaction, right? So it must have been very difficult for them, I'm sure. Um, yeah, so that's I guess the aspect of living at home, going to home-based learning, and also like going back to school and what that was like. And then you also did a very general series of about masks and wearing of masks called Mask Up. Um, so how did you I guess settle on that topic. I guess it's the most like visually defining thing about COVID, right? Which is everybody's masks. But how did you settle on that topic and choose like which images would go into mask up? Because basically every image in that taken of COVID has a mask in it.
Um, I think I wanted to show um, how like the differences in public spaces and how it COVID sort of impacted them. Um, and I actually planned this series at the start of 2020. I think as they announced the first COVID case in Singapore. So as I mentioned earlier, I was sort of inspired by how people were wearing masks even it was before it was made compulsory. So based off that, as I photographed, I realized that uh, sort of you could see defining changes to certain public spaces in Singapore, and I think it would be better if I show it through the slides to the audience. So there were certain portions that um, was sort of visually heartbreaking. Um, Even though circuit breaker was a peaceful time for people, but you could see that they were generally in low spirits, um, and they were wary of one another due to the high number of cases at that point in time. And subsequently, I included photos as we moved on into from phase one to phase two. More people could be outside, dining could resume, seeing basically just seeing people in the streets sort of gave that sense of hope that things would return to normal, and that was what I was going for. And I find that during this pandemic, as people um, like this pandemic has brought out the best and the worst in people, but it's still heartening to see how overall there's this overall sense of unity to adhere to these rules and tide over the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, I think seeing like the empty hawker centers brought back a lot of memories of like the circuit breaker period. I think another photo that you took, which has been used as the banner, I think outside, is an empty, I think CBD was it, and someone's just walking, just one person in like across what used to be a busy road. Yeah, this one, which I think was very striking, like very obvious how COVID has affected the whole nation. Yeah. Just wondering, like, how did you feel seeing all of these, especially in the beginning?
Um, it was very weird because this was taken in the heart of CBD,
Mm.
so it's very weird to see little to almost no cars during peak hours, and it was all very quiet. So the atmosphere was rather somber
Mm.
during that period of time, and I guess it isn't too different from what we are experiencing now. And even though now we are more prepared for such changes, but I think at that point in time, it affected a lot of people in terms of both their work schedule and I think in terms of their mental health as well. Staying at home for 2 months isn't an easy feat, and yeah, but I guess looking back, these were the things that made us stronger as a nation, and sort of being so being able to adapt to such changes as we move, as the situation is rather fluid.
Yeah, I think at that point of time, it was also a very new, like, no one knew what was going to happen or what the situation was going to be like. So definitely that sense of weirdness or that sense of, yeah, being unsure of what to expect. Yeah, you had a few other pictures as well that you wanted to share.
Oh, I wanted to sort of go through my thought process of how I chose these pictures. So it was more of um, wanting to show the changes that happened around Singapore. So starting from right at the beginning, masks were sort of rather uniform in terms of its design and color at that point in time, as there were low supplies of masks. And even though it wasn't compulsory, then you could start seeing people wearing masks in the streets. Uh, and the sight of people going to work in the morning is something of a distant memory. So yeah, it's something that I wanted to include, and it slowly evolved into um, affecting our airports as the pandemic situation got worse um, around the world. We had no choice but to close our borders. So this was taken 3 days right before Changi Airport closed its borders to the rest of the world. And the last one was circuit breaker. So I think through these images, I just wanted to show it wasn't this series evolved from people just wearing masks in public spaces, and then as I photographed over a period of time, I could visually see the changes. So I wanted to show that change in this series.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think we definitely can see like as we progress from circuit breaker all the way to phase two, you also chose like similar locations or similar shots and then showing the progress in that sense. Yeah. So yeah, found it interesting. I wanted to ask, why is the series shot in black and white as opposed to the others?
Um, I get that question a lot. Um, I think for black and white images, it shows um, emotions, and it brings out the mood in the photograph better, because sometimes color can be distracting, and it doesn't bring out the mood in the overall series as much.
Mm. Okay. As opposed to like I guess for schools and all, like the very liveliness of a school, the color also
Um,
lends itself to.
so for the school images, I decided to shoot them in color because um, first thing you could sort of define the differences between the schools, because if it was in black and white,
That's true.
sometimes it
Yeah.
will be difficult
Mhm.
to tell the schools apart from one another.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's something that you're used to seeing, and it sort of resonates with people better that
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your thought process on these three series. We have like a few other series that you took as well, but I'm not sure if we have the time to like sort of get through them. But just wondering if you had any like thoughts to share on like those other series. If you found it interesting, like especially for the social distancing ambassadors, I think, which is a completely new role that has been created again by this pandemic. And I thought it was interesting what you said about um, the fact that they're not really seen, but you also wanted to capture their experience.
I think for the social distancing ambassadors, it was an eye-opening experience for me to document them as well, because initially I had the idea that their roles would all be the same, be it hawker centers, going around the neighborhood. But as I followed them, I realized their roles were very distinct. So for hawker centers, they were covered by NEA, and their roles is to basically ensure people were wearing masks, and ensuring that there was safe distancing while people were queuing for the hawker stalls. And whereas for places like in Chinatown, there's a group of social distancing ambassadors that focuses more on the businesses. So I think they were under SFA, the Singapore Food Authorities. So they go around inspecting food outlets and restaurants to ensure if they had the necessary measures in place. And as they submitted the reports, I could see that some of the restaurants had closed down. So it was also a rather sad moment as we went through, because they would point out that they just saw this restaurant open perhaps a few days ago. Yeah, so it was rather it, the mood wasn't really that good as we walked around. So there's also a group of social distancing ambassadors that are volunteers.
Mhm.
So I think I'm not sure if it's the same for all community centers around Singapore, but at least for Bishan, there is a group of volunteers, members of the public, that actually spend some time over the weekend um, doing safe distancing work. So they would don these lanyards and walk around the estate to sort of maintain this order.
I think community spirit is something that came up quite a lot during this pandemic. Um, yeah. So maybe, do you have any other photos that you were going to talk about or share, or otherwise we can
Um,
get into the.
I think we can get into the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the last of the photos that I prepared.
Okay. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. So the first one is, being a student yourself, how are you coping with growing up during the pandemic?
For me, I'm going into second year into NUS. So lessons has been online since the start of the school semester last year. So I guess it wasn't that drastic for me because I started off already being online. So but as much as there are perks of studying at home, in the comforts of your own home, I would still very much prefer to go to school, to interact with fellow peers, and even the lecturers as well. So, but it wasn't that much of a drastic change as compared to the younger students who had been used to going to school but had to suddenly change to home-based learning.
Yeah, I think for the younger kids especially, because they don't have that long run up to like university, at least, that it's been a very hard 180 switch for them. Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, another question is, how do you manage your time between your passion photography and academic studies, which I think uh, I'm also very impressed by.
That's a very good question. uh, I guess finding time for hobbies is always sort of a challenge, especially for people who have full-time work, or even for students who are always busy with assignments. But I guess the love for the hobby itself, no matter how tired you are or how busy you are, you will always kind of find that empty slot in your weekly schedule for you to be able to go out to photograph, be it for an hour or 2 hours. But it's sort of a good breakaway from your usual routine.
Mhm.
And I think for yeah, you just find ways to find time to do your stories or even street photography. So for one of my stories that I did on Qingming this year, I went to the Lim Chu Kang Cemetery. So I always wanted to be there before sunrise. So yeah, I would find time. Actually, there would always be time because I wouldn't be on a normal basis. I wouldn't wake up so early to do work at all. So I would cycle from home to the graveyard and reach there by about 6:30, and then I'll photograph as the sunrise till about 8:30, and I'll be back home, and I'll start the day.
Hmm. That's a lot of devotion to photography. I think going off of that, do you find that with like academics and other things that are competing for attention for photography, do you still have time to develop it as a skill, or is it more like a hobby? Like in terms of like devotion to improving and enhancing it, or do you find that it comes with the more photos you take?
Um, I think it's not exclusive.
Mm.
You can always do both. It's just about a matter of finding time. Um, you can. It's definitely good to read up on techniques through photo books or online websites. But I find the best practice is still to go out and shoot. So as much as I would juggle some time on the way to school, if I ever need to go, or like traveling from place to place, I would bring a book with me, and yeah, I would spend that short amount of time catching up on things that I really like to read, especially photo books. So um, yeah, I would still find time somehow over the weekend, no matter how early or how late, yeah, to
Mm.
sort of put this into practice, or just basically take my mind off schoolwork.
That's great. Yeah. Someone asked, what were the challenges you faced while taking the photos? Did you need to build a rapport with the students first, and how did you ensure that their schedule isn't like disrupted?
Um, I think for the schools, I had to liaise with the school first, definitely to get the approval of the principal, the teachers. But when I was there, I tried my best not to be disruptive to their lessons. So I would, on a typical day, I would be part of their school curriculum. So I would be in the class, I would be at their PE lessons, the recess. So I was actually in different places throughout the day, but um, I was very aware that um, my actions might disrupt the students. So I tried to be as invisible as possible. If I wasn't photographing, I would stand at the back of the class at one corner. And after a while, even though the students were initially sort of excited to have me around, but as the lesson went on, they would just be sort of submerged into their lessons,
Mm.
and they would probably forget about me. So that was what I tried to do for most lessons.
Okay.
And there was definitely an issue of safe distancing as well,
Mhm.
because in a classroom of 40 students, even though they were seated in the exam style format, but it was still difficult for me. So as I photographed, I tried my best to keep myself safe and them safe as well, by being 1 meter apart. Or if I have to go close or go walk along the aisle, I'll try not to stay too long, and I'll be back either at the front or the back of the class.
Mm. How about the other like series that you did? Were there specific challenges specific to them, or was it much easier than like?
I think for the others, like masking up or social distancing ambassadors, there were definitely more space. There was definitely more space involved out in the public, and out in the open. There wasn't really an issue of safe distancing between one another. It's just of remembering that um, you touch certain surfaces, and then you should sanitize your hands. And apart from that, I think there weren't really major issues.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and yeah, there weren't really major issues for the other series.
Okay, so you also had more scope and space to play around with like angles and things like that. Okay. Um, yeah, there's a question on taking photos during the election. So with so many constitutions, did you focus on your neighborhood only, or did you go to like other estates? And how did you decide like where to take the photos?
I actually went to different institutions, and I didn't photograph in my own. So um, I think it was also based on the information available to me,
Mm-hmm.
because I think at that point in time, they didn't want crowds. So actually, for a lot of walkabouts, there wasn't much info about it online. So, but whenever there was, I'll try to rush down, and I think for the Workers' Party, because they would update their social media, I would be there. But there were certain parts where it was almost like a cat and mouse game because when I reached there, they would be somewhere else, and I would try to keep up.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. So
but I think apart from that, no major issues that I faced. Yeah, but I think it was fun covering the different constituencies, different parties, seeing different ways that they reached out to people, the different ideas that they had.
And I guess as a first time voter, this was also like your first experience of the election, right?
Um, in previous elections, I would attend rallies from time to time,
Okay.
but I think this is, as a first time voter, this felt really different,
Mm.
especially having to see so many different politicians and parties involved because for in the past I would normally just be um, hanging around the rallies in my constituency. Yeah, so it was an eye-opening experience for me.
For sure. Um, there are a couple questions on, I guess, the exhibition, especially because many people didn't expect the pandemic to, turn out the way it has. So I guess, just to answer also for the museum, the exhibition was about documenting COVID at the point in time from circuit breaker to phase two, which is why we also got the photographers to look at these um, aspects. And I think it's still uh, valuable in the sense of documenting at least this portion of COVID. But so, what do you think also of like documenting this phase? And are you still currently taking photos of the pandemic even till today?
Especially for my Mask Up series, it's a ongoing documentation as the pandemic hasn't ended and there's still a lot of changes. As you can see, the just recently the National Day Parade has been postponed, and we are going back into phase two. So, as these changes go on, I'm still continuing to photograph for this series, and I find that some of the images that I produce aren't too different from the ones that I have photographed last year. So, as the pandemic goes on, I'm curious to see how things pan out, how things change along the way, and hopefully at the end of it, there's this huge um, body of work that would um, sort of be valuable in terms of um, how we had coped and how we had adapted during this pandemic.
Yeah, I think for sure there's a value in documenting every part of this experience, given that it's such a hopefully a one-off, and also like a life-changing, I think we can safely say, experience for everybody around the world. Um, yeah, so speaking of that, actually, in terms of like continuing to document over the pandemic, we have a question on do you think that your photography style has changed over the pandemic?
Um, Definitely, I find that my photography style actually depends on my mood that day. So in the past, sometimes I would get close to people. Sometimes I would stay further away from people. But especially for the pandemic, I didn't want to put myself and others at risk. So I definitely had to stay slightly further away from people. And I think you could kind of see that in some of the images that I produced. So, but I think in terms of style, I had already been shooting people from afar, and it wasn't something new to me, but it's definitely something I'm gearing more towards now.
For sure. How about like I don't know, have you been experimenting with any other photography that you've been doing during the pandemic? Like trying out new things or
Um, I think there were certain points in time where the pandemic situation got really bad, and
mm,
uh, I think in order to keep myself and my family safe, we tried our best not to leave our homes unnecessarily.
mm,
So there were certain times that I went into macro photography, shooting insects. Then
mm,
that way you wouldn't get in touch with anybody.
right, yeah.
So I've been doing macro photography, um, taking self portraits at home, just fooling around with things that you see online that is something worth trying.
Mm. I guess it's also given us time to sort of go into that as well. Um, a very long term question. How do you see yourself in the next 10 years, and what are your future endeavors?
Wow, honestly, it's something I haven't really thought of myself, but I think um, I would definitely be photographing in 10 years' time. Uh, Although I'm not sure if this is going to be a full time work for me or will it remain as a hobby, but definitely exploring my options. And I think it's always good to try new things and to have different experiences in life. And I
Mm,
think that would make me a more wholesome person. And it's always good to make an informed decision. And by experiencing different things, I think that would help me reach that goal.
for sure. In terms of documenting people and experiences, were there any moments that touched you the most? And what were the challenges you faced? I guess we also covered this a little bit earlier.
I think for the moments that touched me the most, I frequent Chinatown a lot, even prior to the pandemic. So seeing how the area where many residents would gather to play chess, um, when it was cordoned off from the public, I could see that some of the residents around there were really sad because it was, apart from playing chess, it was an area for them to mingle and mix around, especially for the old folks. So it was a rather touching moment for me as well. I think there was a photograph that I shot um, during that time. Let me go back to it. Yeah, this one. Um, so at that point in time, they they were strictly not allowed to gather. So the chess corner had to be cordoned off, and now I think even now the seats are cordoned off to prevent them from sitting around. So this was one of the the moments, unforgettable moments that I had. The next one would be the single person crossing the road in CBD. So I think never in my life have I seen it so empty, especially during peak hours. So that was the second one. Um, Challenges, I think it's in terms of um, being wary, also wary of the people around me. Um, Even though it's not as bad as there could be, there is still space for you to socially distance yourself. It's just that you had to be consciously aware and also of the touch surfaces and the people that you have interacted with.
Mm, definitely. I think we have time for one last question. As a youth photographer, what are the messages you hope to convey through your photographs?
Um, wow,
Or are you consciously trying to present something, or is it more of a,
I
I
think
think,
it's very spontaneous.
mm,
For me, I try to go about doing good work, and I think for people of my age who are photographing as well, I think it's always good to continue shooting, to try different things and to sort of experience more, and that way you'll probably see your work evolve as well. So it's not something that I'm consciously moving towards, but I think as I look back at my images, they are evolving, although there isn't a particular message that I'm trying to send across.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Brian, for coming here today and talking us through your experiences and progress and processes. Yeah, so that's all for today's program. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, keep a lookout for more picture in the pandemic programs that will come up throughout the course of the year. And yeah, thanks so much for watching.